Arc Raiders is a fantastic game, as I'm sure you've heard by now, and I'm really happy to finally see someone bring something to gaming that, yes, might take heavy inspiration from other games, and doesn't strictly speaking do anything new in terms of individual features, but that manages to put it all together really well. And to do so while giving it a very unique look and feel, which is one of this game's absolute strongest points. The server slam we had this last weekend proved to me how good the fundamental gameplay is and how solid the core systems of the game are. The test was very limited on weapons, items, crafting, etc., but it still managed to provide more fun than I've had in the last months playing Tarkov. But I don't just want to sit here and glaze Arc Raiders and Embark, because everyone else is doing that already, and while they deserve the glaze they are getting, I do want to try and bring up some observations, some critiques, and some other things that people might not be thinking about ahead of the game's very imminent release. Now, you don't really need any prerequisite knowledge of extraction shooters or extraction-based games with Arc Raiders. It doesn't really come off as an extraction shooter at all. The intro is nice and quick, the UI is simple and easy to understand, and the game gets you playing very fast and is in no way overwhelming. Everything is kind of dumbed down, but it's not in a bad way, because instead of different ammo calibers for weapons, you have light, medium, and heavy ammo. There is no individual mags in a rig or any of that sweaty milsim stuff, it's just ammo for the guns. Inventory management is basically just managing shield rechargers, heals, and the ammo, which is very simple considering the traditional extraction shooters like Tarkov and ABI, and it's much more akin to battle royales. Gunplay is very simple, basic random bloom, but the gun upgrade and attachment system is very impactful. As an example, the reload time reduction on a level 3 Stitcher compared to a level 1 Stitcher is 33% faster. That's winning a firefight right there. None of this 1% reduction here, 1% there, min-max bullshit, just straight up 16% per upgrade. And I say that being a fan of min-maxing too, but for this game, this is the completely right way to do it. Equally powerful are the attachments, which can reduce recoil by 15% or reduce max spread by 25%, etc. And you also have some different types of attachments, so one grip can affect horizontal recoil and the other one vertical, for example. So you can choose according to your preference, which allows for some depth in weapon customization. Not just level 3 better than level 2 and purple better than blue. It heavily incentivizes you investing in weapons as you really want those improvements. It also makes you want to maintain and repair weapons as an essential resource sink. And upgrading weapons and adding attachments don't increase the damage of a weapon, which doesn't create too much of a gap between the people having money for upgrades and those that don't, like the ones that run free kits, for example. Some attachments do seem to be a bit more rare, like suppressors, or at the very least harder to get and more expensive to craft. They are going to be very powerful though, considering how important audio is in this game, so I guess it only makes sense. And speaking about the sound is incredible. I love the sound design, the sound effects, music, ambience, reverb, it all hits. And playing it on, dare I say, my overkill $1,200 headphone setup was something else entirely. It just really sucks you in, and it more than just achieves immersive audio. Even the little purple loot sound is just standout and fantastic. The game has some really great dynamic moments in general, not just with audio, the big new word being emergent gameplay, but it manages to get some really fun, unique moments going, and I think I heard someone say that Arc Raiders manages to give you battlefield moments, just not in a battlefield game, and I think that's pretty accurate. And what's even more impressive is that, at the same time, it also manages to give you old school PUBG moments. I'm sure we all remember those, and to some degree, I think it also manages to give you the old school Tarkov moments. Not as well, not as intense, but in part, and that's more than enough for this game. Because games are different, and Arc Raiders doesn't need to do it all, for everyone. And most importantly, it doesn't need to satisfy the hardcore crowd. And I think there is a vacuum in the market for a more casual, if you want, extraction shooter, even though myself and plenty of other people are going to play Arc Raiders anything but casually. And because of this vacuum, I think Arc Raiders will be the next big game, the next big step forward within this genre, especially if they continue to do things right after launch. because I don't think the extraction shooter genre is played out at all. I think we have just started to see the potential for this type of tension that it manages to create. So for Embark to successfully walk the tightrope here and make this drug of tension more widely available, I think is very good, not just for the genre, but also for gaming in general. One thing you'll notice very quickly in this game is that it's very difficult to 1 versus X, meaning 1 versus 2 or more, unless you are able to play on positioning, which you can't always dictate, as you obviously can't decide every fight to take and how to take it. But this is mainly because magazine sizes are very limiting, and it's very difficult to kill more than one player with a single mag, with the exception of a few very slow firing weapons like shotguns or snipers, which in some cases, like a clean sniper headshot, can be a one-shot kill, or some of the more high-end and upgraded weapons. The Peeker's advantage meta is also going to be insane. Netcode, I think, is going to manifest as the biggest complaint for most players in this game, if it's like it was during the server slam. Now, the reason for that could have been that it was a server slam and that the servers were intentionally getting cooked, which is very likely. But being able to see around corners without having to expose yourself is already the most powerful mechanic in a third-person game. But add some struggling netcode to that, and the Peeker's advantage will be abused thoroughly. I promise you that. A lot of people do complain about the third person, saying that they wish it was first person. And yes, I would say so too, but only if they had built it with first person in mind from the start. I think that would have been amazing, but it would also have been a very different game. Third person works really well, and that is what the game is made for. And I think that kind of just ends that discussion. That doesn't mean third person is perfect. It has its issues, it has its cheeses, but I do feel like the combat overall is pretty well balanced. And if the release version gets rid of the lag, I think it will feel really good. The game also closes extracts one by one, so increasing the reward of staying in a raid longer and getting better loot also increases the risk of extraction. And I think that's good because it increases the risk and the reward fairly equally. But as there is also going to be less and less teams the further into the match you get, it doesn't overdo it. This is also in part helped by the game having lots of different extraction points, which I think is very key, and I hope they keep the Raider Hatch keys relatively cheap for the full release of the game. Because dying should happen when fighting other players in high loot value areas fighting over loot, not at extraction points. In my opinion, it always feels so much worse dying trying to extract when already having gotten your loot than fighting other players to get loot in the first place. I think that dying at extracts creates a really bad experience, and you do need some risk to extract, don't get me wrong, but the experience is so negative that if it happens too often, it will decrease people's enjoyment of the game substantially. The tension doesn't then come from the expectation of getting loot, but instead from the punishment of losing loot. Two very different types of tension. The game already has a good amount of risk in the gear and the equipment you bring in, and given the more casual mainstream aim of Arc Raiders, I think that's more than enough. It also creates a really bad incentive for players. If it's too easy to consistently encounter players at extracts and too easy to kill players trying to extract, this will help create extract campers. And I think a great example of this is the Red Lakes elevator extract on the Dama map from the server slam. It's right next to a big building looking down on the extract. There is very little cover right around the extract, and it's just begging someone to sit there and camp it. And this was always one of Tarkov's biggest problems, one of its many big problems, because Tarkov, depending on the map and what spawn you got, could have as little as 2 to 3 extract points that were realistically open to you. And some of these extracts would be very predictable, as they were the main, always open extracts. Therefore, especially considering that you could just one-shot players if getting the drop on them pretty easily in Tarkov, extract camping quickly became very popular, and it just creates a really shitty experience for anyone playing the game. The flares are a really cool idea, but I do think they are a little bit excessive almost. Sound is already such a huge giveaway as it really carries. You can hear fights across like 60% of the map. And the flares also really incentivizes you to fight indoors whenever you can, because the flares will be blocked by the roof and therefore not be visible outside of the building should you get knocked. So getting caught out in the open is way worse than taking a fight inside of a building. Now, we only had one map on the server slam, so with some of the other maps maybe being a little bit bigger, the flares might feel more of an actual need in the game. Because on the dam map from the server slam, it's a little bit too obvious where the fight is going down, thanks to the flares. It makes it really easy to beeline straight to a fight, as you can very confidently just push all the way up to where the fight is, because it's so clearly telegraphed exactly where the fight is going down. And this would be fine if the map was a little bit bigger, to where you can't cross half the map in about a minute, because if the map was bigger, it would give a fight more of a chance to finish up before people were likely to get there, and therefore also incentivize you to finish up the fighting and the looting quickly. And you wouldn't just feel like whenever you get into a fight, you just get run over by third parties constantly. I also just really hope the other maps are a little bit bigger, just in general. I like the dam map from the server slam, but it is a little bit small. It's, as far as I can interpret it from the game, supposed to be the equivalent of a Ground Zeroes in Tarkov. For those that don't know, Ground Zeroes is the only map in Escape from Tarkov where if you are under level 20, you can only queue against other players who are also under level 20. That way it can serve as a little bit of an intro map that is a little bit more beginner friendly. But I guess we have to wait and see exactly what they mean when they say that the map will only be available to quote-unquote new raiders. Does that mean like Tarkov, a under and over lobby with a certain level cutoff? Or is it that only people below a certain level can queue it permanently? So after a certain level, dam is just unavailable for you to play. We'll just have to wait and see. I think the arc aggro is fine, and I think most of the archetypes are fine as well, and the PvE is really essential for the game to flow as well as it does. The arc creates fights and movements around the map, they help expose players and teams, but they also, most importantly, prevent a lot of the problems with third-person games and firefights. It keeps everything dynamic, as players have to react to something besides just other players. If it was just players versus players, that would just end up super campy with people just cheesing third person the entire time. The Rocketeer, Leaper, and Queen are very well balanced, I think. They are big, easy to see, and they generally move very slow, same with the Bastion. The Wasps are also fine because, while a lot faster and flying, they aren't very heavily armored, and they can generally be killed with a couple of bursts, even from something like a Stitcher. The Hornets can at times ruin a firefight more than spice it up. The Rocketeer too, if you do aggro it, but it's much slower and easier to avoid, and I feel like then it's less of an arc problem and more of a you problem. But it doesn't feel good to have a team versus team firefight ruined by arc aggro from a Hornet that is a little bit too heavily armored for how fast it moves. However, I do think that's really the only problem with the arcs and the PvE in this game. I think it's pretty much perfect. I think the AI fills a very, very essential, very, very good spot in the game, and they really play a part in making the game feel dynamic and fun. It's also important to note that what we got during the server slam is only the early game. Very few higher end items were available during the playtest. And I noticed that it became increasingly easier to deal with the arc without doing so costing me a PvP fight the more geared I got, especially thanks to extended magazines and the like. Because of the long reload times and small magazine sizes that I mentioned earlier, dealing with a robot can easily cost you a fight, and it just doesn't feel very good. But I think we are going to grow into a better PvE balance once the full game progression is out, and once attachments and more kitted weapons become the norm. So the main problem with the PvE is therefore just the health of some of the minor arc early game, and I think that it's fine that the bigger ones are a legitimate, serious threat that you preferably just try to avoid or play around, because they are also easy enough to avoid and play around. I do also think it's going to be interesting with the lure and the decoy grenades. I think those are going to grow into the meta of the game pretty significantly if they don't change the AI and the robots a bit before the launch. The game sometimes puts you into a game that has already started, and I don't know if this happens because it failed to fill the lobby at game start, which I do kind of have a hard time believing that that was the case during the server slam. It could also maybe be because people disconnect from the game, but more than all, I think it's because they are doing it intentionally and dynamically to refill the lobby if enough of the players die early into the game. Because in some matches where the fighting started early and you can hear fighting for a huge distance from the beginning of the match, there would just be more fighting over the course of the entire match, and it felt like we would run into more teams throughout the entire game. But that's, obviously far from a bulletproof observation. The game, as far as I know, when you play solo, which is to queue solo without a team fill, you are put up only against other solo players. The game really shines though when you're playing in teams, and I would even urge you to try to just queue with randoms if you don't have anyone to play with. I had some great games with just some random players, because the solo experience, while in some ways more tense and immersive, if that's your vibe, it doesn't flow anywhere near as nice as team versus team. Because when playing solo, because you seemingly have the same or even a slightly higher number of players, but they are all running around by themselves, you have so many more contact points throughout a match because everyone is spread out way more evenly. And this is where the flares, for example, go from being excessive, which they are in the team games, to being just kind of bad for the game's flow, which they are in the solo games. Because if two solos encounter each other and one gets downed, which is usually the outcome, then every other player has a very easy time locating that fight. And because you're in a solo lobby, then it is way more likely that someone is close by because you have a much greater spread of people around the map. And this basically leads to a chain reaction of people just third-partying each other. I had some solo runs where I would watch 3, 4, even 5 flares get shot up from the same place within a short while of each other, then decide, okay, well, I gotta see what's going on, and I went to push it myself, killed the guy who's left over, and then I got pushed by guy number 7 in line for the fight. Or I would push a fight, and there would be people posted up near the area of the fight, just ratting, waiting for people to enter or exit the area. And that's the other major solo problem. With third person, you don't need to expose yourself to see, and you can basically see around corners, which makes ratting very powerful. Now, some amount of ratting is fine, and I would argue even good for a game that is trying to create tension, like extraction shooters obviously are. But ratting wouldn't be quite as powerful if you have a team with you. But when you are on your own with no real way to revive yourself, ratting is basically just an insta-loss. Ratting is also already powerful enough in first-person extraction shooters, so I do have some concerns about how this could manifest in a third-person extraction shooter like Arc Raiders when the game gets played and figured out a little bit. I think there is a reason we haven't seen a lot of third-person extraction shooters. There were already some pretty cheeky and some outright disgusting spots found during the server slam and the first playtests, so full release is going to be interesting. So this is another huge factor that is making me recommend that if you're going to play Arc Raiders, play it in groups, even with randoms, unless you specifically enjoy the solo experience. In that case, knock yourself out, and I'm glad the game prioritizes solo matchmaking with other solos, even if it's not in an explicit solo queue. The game is also made on the Unreal Engine, and even though it's a fairly well-modified version of the Unreal Engine, it still has a lot of the same core problems. The performance is good, and it's definitely much better optimized than most recent Unreal Engine titles we have seen, but DLSS is still very much needed as a crutch, and it's likely to be a mandatory crutch for a lot of players. And in my opinion, call me old, but if you need DLSS and all the trade-offs that come with DLSS, like artifacting, for your game to run okay on mid to high-end hardware and high settings, your game is not fucking optimized. DLSS should be a tool for people on outdated, subpar hardware to allow those people to still be able to play games at the cost of the various problems DLSS has. It should not be a necessity for people on high-end hardware to play the game on high settings. that is unacceptable in my opinion. And while I think this is mainly the engine's fault, I just wish developers could start choosing something better to develop on. I played the game on my rig with a 9800X3D, a 4070 Ti, and 64 gigs of 6000 MHz RAM. And with everything on Epic, I needed DLSS on quality to just hit 120 FPS at best. And for an action-filled FPS-dependent game like this on that hardware, that's not great. Granted, I was pushing it to see how the game would do, and I will likely not play on these settings when the game launches. I'll spend a lot more time fine-tuning settings, as I'm sure there are some settings that I probably missed during the server slam or didn't have time to look into that you could change to improve performance without any real cost to the visual quality. The DLSS artifacting is still just insane, like every other Unreal Engine title apparently, as no matter how much you spray paint shit, it's still shit. Cables, railings, anything with one object moving in front of another is just painfully obvious. Foliage and trees are also not exactly great. The urban environments are definitely where the game shines and has the least of these issues. The great lighting does make up for a lot of the weaker points visually, both indoors but especially in the outdoor environments. I've also heard people saying that the game looks completely fine and that there are no issues, and that is just dishonest in my opinion and not constructive for anything. If someone utters that as a genuine opinion, they probably typed it on a Braille keyboard. You would need to be visually impaired to say the game looks perfect with no complaints. Does the game look good at first glance, especially, compressed on YouTube or through a live stream? Yes. But when you really take a look at it, which you are forced to when playing on a decent PC, the cracks are fairly apparent. DLAA on native seems to be the best choice for visual fidelity, but it will come with the obvious performance hit for people without strong enough hardware, because this is Unreal Engine, which is allergic to the word native. I would love to test more of this to see where the sweet spot lies, but I did prioritize the limited time we had on just enjoying the game and playing it as much as I could. But the parts of the game that look good look really good. And more importantly, what carries the game is that the environmental design and the art is fantastic. I love the look of the game in terms of the characters and the Ark robots as well. It's a very cool and unique art direction, and I really enjoy it. Thankfully though, there also doesn't seem to be a lot of area dependent performance hit, which is very nice, where some games might drop 20, 30, 40% of its FPS in certain areas. That doesn't seem to be the thing in Ark Raiders. But that is some of what I'm thinking before the release of Ark Raiders in just less than a week. I'm going to leave it there so we're not here all night. Let me know what you think about Ark Raiders. What did you think about the server slam if you played it? And let me know if you are going to be buying the game. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you topside.